Hello.
Both at the same time. Hey, Jeffrey, what are we doing here today?
Well, Dan, this is the start of a new podcast here called The Whole Record.
The whole record?
The Whole Record.
The whole record? Like, what kind of record? A world record?
A music record. Not just a single piece of vinyl, but an entire recollection of a band's discography.
Oh, so it doesn't have to be a vinyl record. It could also be a CD. It could be a cassette. Just any sort of full album, full length. Gotcha.
Full length, and not just but it's the record of the band themselves as a whole. See, the point of this podcast is we're going to be taking a discography of a band, and each of us will be ranking that based on personal preference. This is all opinion. And then we'll be going through each album chronologically and discussing why we put it where we put it.
That sounds like an awesome idea, and sounds like something that I would just love to do right now. How about you, Jeff?
Absolutely, and we're going to.
Hey, what band are we going to be discussing? Because we need a band if we're going to be discussing a discography.
Well, today's first episode, our pilot, if you will, is going to be about Modest Mouse.
Modest Mouse. Oh my gosh. You know what? I have a confession to make about Modest Mouse. Can I make a confession about Modest Mouse?
Go for it.
They have put out, okay, they're not my favorite band of all time, okay? But they have put out my favorite album of all time. But I'm not going to tell you what that album is yet.
Yes, until we get to the ranking here.
Until we rank it.
So for those of you, I'm sure if you're listening to this, you're probably familiar with Modest Mouse, maybe to an extent. But Modest Mouse is a really influential indie rock band that formed in Washington in the 90s, 1992 to be exact. And they were sort of the big under the radar band for many, many years.
Yeah, the first time I heard about Modest Mouse was I think in 1997, and I would have been in like 10th or 11th grade, and it was in Spin magazine, and it was actually like an up and coming indie article where I think they still do it to this day, where I think it actually might be called Under the Radar, but they do a segment in their
I think it is because I've read Under the Radar in Spin before.
And Modest Mouse were there at that time. So, I read the little article about it, and I remember just being intrigued by reading it because they kind of described it as like almost like an Americana Pixies or something.
Yeah, what do you remember more of the quote at all? Because I think you've explained, you said kind of an Americana meets the Pixies.
Well, I remember then right after that, and this was all coincidence, I probably would have never actually checked out Modest Mouse the same way that I did had it not been for a friend who I was riding in the back seat of his car on the way up to Davenport. We live in Muscatine, Iowa, and Davenport is a town that's like 20 miles from here. And we were riding on the way up there, and he actually had a compilation tape that he made with 2 Modest Mouse songs on it. I don't remember what the songs were, but I remember liking them quite well. And then I just decided to actually take a chance, and I special ordered them from the local Music Land.
Music Land.
Yes. And so, anyway, I don't remember specifically what that article talked about, but I remember it made me want to check them out.
That's really awesome. Yeah, like Modest Mouse for me. Do you have more to finish on your discovery?
Not at all.
See, mine's a little less, I guess, hip. If I sound pretty lame, but see, my Modest Mouse. It's never
lame to discover an awesome band, Jeffrey.
This is true, but mine was a little more, I guess, kind of your typical way of discovering music, especially if you listen to like the radio. My Modest Mouse discovery was, I was probably 14 maybe, and I was kind of eating up whatever music I could get that I thought sounded cool. I was in my I want to discover rock music proper kind of phase, and but I would still occasionally, like, I'd watch MTV and VH1 still, because, like, they would still play rock music, and I was, like, looking for alternative music specifically, but, like, it was kind of one of my main sources. I don't recall YouTube really, I don't know if YouTube existed at the time, I can't remember.
I think it did, but it existed in a totally different way at that time.
Yeah, because I think it wasn't, because I remember YouTube in, like, 2007, but I don't remember it that far back.
Yeah.
But Modest Mouse, the music video for Float On was in heavy rotation on VH1 and MTV at the time. I remember I would stay up till like 2 a.m. because that was when you could see music videos, because they slowly moved away from that format over the 90s and 2000s. So I saw the Float On music video, and I saw it played multiple times, and I was like, this is a very cool music video. This is a very well made. I don't know if have you seen the video?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
I've seen all their videos that they've made.
Yeah, it's a very cool little artsy sort of leading the lambs to slaughter thing going on in the video. It's very cool. And and his voice and the music kind of caught me off guard. While yeah, it's definitely very poppy, catchy, radio friendly stuff for Modest Mouse. But it's still through that like Modest Mouse weird lens.
Yeah,
and you still have Isaac Brock's kind of lispy, strange, shouty vocals over it. And I was impressed, and got the CD pretty quickly afterwards.
Yeah, it's and that's the thing, man, is I think you just said it right there, Jeffrey, is that Modest Mouse is one of those bands that will, regardless of what you think about them in the long run, they always seem to make you stop and listen at least. Because there aren't many bands like them. There's a couple that I could almost compare them to, but even then, Modest Mouse still has such a touch of originality. I remember when I first put in the Modest... I went to Musicland and special ordered the Modest Mouse CD, which we'll talk about. And I remember when I first heard that, and this was before Modest Mouse became commercial. I remember just thinking to myself, what the hell am I listening to here? It was definitely like a really strange experience listening to them for the first time in the 90s. Speaking of the 90s, and in fact about most of Modest Mouse's career, before we get into ranking our personal lists of from worst to best of Modest Mouse's full lengths, we're only going to be doing the 6 official full lengths. But I just want to say real quick, for those of you out there who want to hear the full spectrum of Modest Mouse's music, there are some great compilations and great EPs out there. Starting with the very first one that came out called The Fruit That Ate Itself. I think it came out the year before This Is a Long Drive, which is their debut album. And then also I would recommend checking out the compilation Building Nothing Out of Something, which also includes a lot of the same songs from the Interstate 8 EP. And then we got Night on the Sun. I'm not familiar with that one. Everywhere in His Nasty Parlor Tricks, which came out in 2001, right after The Moon in Antarctica. And then No One's First and You're Next, which came out in 2009. And then also there's a compilation called Sad Sappy Sucker. For those of you who aren't familiar with that record, that actually was supposed to be their debut album, which came out on K Records and saw the light of day in 2001. Building Nothing Out of Something came out shortly before that. But anyway, all these are great records to check out as well. But they're not official full lengths, so that's why we're not ranking them. But I just want to say I recommend checking them out, as every single one of them are great as well. And also as essential part of the Modest Mouse discography and story as the full lengths.
The discography, the EPs and the compilations. I think "Build Nothing Out of Something" and "Sad Sappy Sucker" are compilations of those EPs, I believe.
No, Sad Sappy Sucker was Building Nothing Out of Something is a compilation of the Interstate 8 EPs, and then some stuff that was I don't think made it on like their first two records, like kind of like B-sides. Sad Sappy Sucker was actually their that was actually going to be called their first album. It came out in 2001, but it was actually supposed to be like their first album, and it got shelved by K Records. So originally to be Modest Mouse's debut, it got shelved for several years, and then it got re-released. But it also includes the Blue Cadet, Do You Connect? Like sort of, I think that was like a 7-inch that came out, and it also includes a lot of weird stuff that Isaac Brock used to have, like an answering machine like service, and he would like write these songs when people would like call his house, and it's really interesting. It's definitely not, you can definitely tell that it's kind of like sketches of Modest Mouse songs, but it's definitely like a great blueprint. You can kind of hear where eventually, if this guy gets into a band with his music, it's gonna be amazing, which it ended up being. So, yeah. But it's an interesting listen nonetheless, and there's actually quite a few good songs on it. But it's definitely really, really crude as far as the recording quality. I think most of it was recorded on a 4-track cassette.
Yeah, I've listened to some of it, and yeah, it's definitely it's something I personally would recommend once you've already gotten into the band proper, and maybe kind of go back for historical purposes.
Yeah, it's kind of a lot of people have said that they kind of viewed it as like for completist, whatever that means.
I have listened through Build Nothing Out of Something, has some great songs on it.
Yeah,
I really do like the No One's First and Your Next EP. I've listened through pretty much everything, and before we kind of go into the albums proper, you mentioned Interstate 8.
Yes.
Which the Interstate 8 EP was included for the most part on Build Nothing Out of Something.
Yes.
Except they left out what could very well be my personal favorite Modest Mouse song, Edit the Sad Parts. That song is a song that it is not on.
Yeah, that's not on there. You're right.
But it's on the Interstate. Yeah,
it's on the Interstate 8. That is a great song.
We have the track listing pulled up if you're wondering.
Yeah.
But it is literally like one of the most heart-wrenching things I think that Isaac has ever written.
This entire album, I mean, honestly, like this compilation could be another Modest Mouse album and be just as good as any. I mean, Never Ending Math Equation, the song Interstate 8, Broke. They do a version of Sleepwalking. That old like that I don't remember who it's by. Santo and Johnny. There's so many good songs. Baby Blue Sedan, Other People's Lives. Yeah, anyway, we're going to just keep talking. Yeah,
we'll talk. We can go on.
This podcast will turn into about that album if we don't.
Anyway, Edit the Sad Parts. If I wanted to make everyone bawl and cry, I would have it played at my funeral.
A great album. There's quite a few Modest Mouse songs in the discography, and we could discuss a little bit about that. That could make anyone cry and bawl, honestly.
Oh yeah. So we've gone through the EPs. That's kind of your supplemental Modest Mouse material. Who knows? Maybe we can revisit the band in the future and rank the EPs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that'd be great.
For like a second follow-up part. But anyway, so we're gonna go into our own personal lists now. Do you want to start, or would you like me to?
Doesn't matter. What would you rather start?
I'll go ahead and start.
Okay.
So Modest Mouse, they have 6 studio albums, and so this is as a reminder for those who may have forgotten, we're ranking the albums, our personal opinions here. Remember, everyone has an opinion, so don't be offended. It's an opinion, man. From our personal worst, and that doesn't necessarily mean the album is bad. It just means it's our least favorite of the discography.
For the record, I don't think they've ever made a bad album.
No, I don't think so either. I think other albums have merit and they're all good in certain ways.
Yep. Agreed.
So from worst to first. So we're going to start for me. My number 6 is Strangers to Ourselves. That is the most recent Modest Mouse release, released in 2015, so only just a couple of years ago. Strangers to Ourselves. My next album is, I'll break the pattern after this, but is the one before that, 2007's We Were Dead Before the Ship Even Sank. That was also, these are their major major label albums, so. And then after We Were Dead this is where my little pattern breaks here, is actually their debut album. It kind of sits almost in the middle for me. This is a long drive for someone with nothing to think about. That's a bit of a mouthful of an album title. So that's my third. 4, coming in for 4 for me, is Good News for People Who Love Bad News. That is the big hit album for them, the one that got me to notice. And then coming in at number 5, this is considered a favorite for many, but is The Lonesome Crowded West, one of their big albums. And then my personal favorite, my all-time favorite Modest Mouse album, is The Moon in Antarctica, which is their major label debut for Epic. So that's my list.
Okay. Well, I am going to go through my list now. And anyway, I am going to say one thing, and that is that Strangers to Ourselves is the only Modest Mouse record that I can honestly say I've listened to less than 10 times. So, I'm familiar with it, but I'm not as familiar with it as the other ones. Plus, I don't own it, but I have heard it. So, what I'm going to do, having said that, is I'm going to agree with Jeff here. My number 6, Strangers to Ourselves. Now, going from Strangers to Ourselves, the second most recent, We Were Dead Before the Ship Even Sank. I would definitely say that that's my number 5. Okay. Number 4, I'm going to put Good News for People Who Love Bad News. My number 3, This Is a Long Drive for Someone with Nothing to Think About. My number 2, I'm going to put The Moon in Antarctica. And, ladies and gentlemen, now it's the time that I can announce what my favorite album of all time is, and that is The Lonesome Crowded West. So, ladies and gentlemen, I gotta say that our list was actually, like, our lists were actually pretty close.
Pretty close.
Like
this time.
yeah, this time, exactly. Just a few things flipped around, and that's all.
Yep, just a couple of slightly different opinions are number ones, but are flipped from each other. Actually, no. Did you put This Is a Long Drive as your second?
I put This Is a Long Drive as my third.
Or my third. Okay, so
Good News is my fourth, and then Moon in Antarctica is my second.
So yeah, we did literally flip our.
We literally flipped the top 4, or the last 4.
All right, this is the point in the podcast where we start talking about each album chronologically. So Modest Mouse released their debut full-length album, their debut LP in 1996. This Is a Long Drive for Someone with Nothing to Think About.
And it was on Up Records, which is, for those of you who don't know, is a pretty well-known Northwest label, not as well known as that of Sub Pop or K Records, but at the time, it totally makes sense that a band that sounded like Modest Mouse found themselves on a label like that, because they were around a bunch of good company. Built to Spill has put out records on that label as well. Caustic Resin, just a bunch of really, really great bands from the Northwest. So I would definitely recommend checking some of those out. But anyway, Modest Mouse, this is a long drive for someone with nothing to think about. Now, if you guys remember, I put it at number 3 on my list. It is my third favorite album from Modest Mouse. And the reason why I put it there is because it doesn't have the gorgeous poppiness of Good News for People Who Love Bad News, which I really, really like. I think Good News was a fantastic record. But it has such a deep meaning to me in terms of it's the second Modest Mouse record that I bought. And I listened to both of these records, Lonesome Crowded West and Long Drive for Someone with Nothing to Think About. I wore them out in high school. And I still to this day don't understand how Isaac Brock, and for that matter, the drummer and bassist, Eric Judy and Jeremiah Green, I don't understand how they got the sounds that they got with their instruments on these records, man. I mean, from the get-go, Dramamine starts off with one of the best bass lines. I mean, I think I read somewhere in an article that Brand New, when they were touring for their first demo, Brand New, another great band to check out, by the way, were actually sound checking by playing the bass line to Dramamine on that tour. Just about every sound check. And then all of a sudden this beautiful, cold, crisp guitar comes from Isaac Brock. And that just sets the tone for the entire album. But at times, it doesn't always remain that crystal, and it's not even a crystal clear record. It's a really dirty recorded record in the first place. But there are times where it just gets really intense. I mean, my God, Beachside Property. I mean, he's screaming about whatever it is that he's screaming about. I know that there's some stuff about unions, and there's some stuff about, like it just he sounds like a really, really upset blue collar worker in a punk band. Custom Concern. Some of the, there's that one line where he's like, I get up just about noon. My head sends a message for me to reach for my shoes and then walk. Gotta go to work, gotta have a job. I mean, I don't know anybody.
Gotta go to work, gotta go to work.
I don't know anybody who's communicated that type of just, I don't know, hopelessness.
Well, it's so simplistic in its delivery and in, I don't want to say, and I don't mean that in a bad way. This is the point of Isaac Brock, and especially those lines that you just said are very... They're simple and they're relatable, so therefore it makes them a little more complicated in that everybody has been through that. The majority of people, middle class, lower class people, have to go to work every day. Mm-hmm. And rather than realizing their potential to do something greater, they're stuck in a dead-end job in the Midwest, the East, the West, Actually, I wanted to point out the whole, sort of Northwest. The Northwest, the West in general, is a huge recurring concept in Modest Mouse's discography. The middle class, the lower class of the West, which we'll get into. Mm-hmm. And you can feel that on this album, on the first two records especially.
Oh, yeah.
And with and even the titles, I mean, The Lonesome Crowded West, and then This Is a Long Drive for Someone with Nothing to Think About, conjures up these images of us that we all have driving aimlessly from one long trip to another, not really thinking about anything important.
Yeah, there's this reoccurring theme on the first two Modest Mouse records, for sure, about traveling that I've kind of noticed. Especially on this record. I mean, look at the album cover. It says it all. It's just like this desolate highway, and it looks kind of like a winter Sunday or something. That's what it puts me in mind of. The way I would describe this record is like icy.
Oh, yeah.
Really icy. Like it sounds like a Sunday winter thaw. You know what I mean?
Icy.
It's still cold.
I feel like Icy is another recurring motif we'll get to also, because I have a lot to say about that as we go further. For me, I wanted to talk a little bit about the album and my experience with it. Mine's a little different than yours.
Mm-hmm.
So when I got into Modest Mouse, it was I went backwards. I got Good News for People Who Love Bad News first because it was the big hit. It was the song. It had the song on it I wanted to hear, and I got that album, and then I heard Moon in Antarctica, and then I heard Lonesome Crowded West, and then I heard Long Drive. And so Long Drive for me was I had already experienced the bulk of the Modest Mouse discography to that point.
Mm-hmm.
This was before I think We Were Dead. So this was like the most recent Modest Mouse album for me at the time, even though it was their first. Sure. And for a long time, I kind of felt like it was... What I felt to me was it was sort of like the skeleton of what would come on the next album and sort of be fleshed out the next two albums. And it always seemed a little almost incomplete in a weird way, even though it is a pretty lengthy record and it is a meaty record. There's a lot to it and it does feel like a complete record, but at the same time to me it always felt like it was sort of the rough sketch, the prototype of what would come, which is why it was ranked for me at lower. I ranked it lower than you did. I put it before Good News for People Who Love Bad News. It was my number 4 record for Modest Mouse. So it's kind of in the middle almost of my rank, and I think that there's a good reason for that because there's some great musicianship on it for being an indie rock sort of jangly sort of dirty record, but like they jam on this thing.
They do.
And
some of the songs do get really lengthy, and for me, it's I kind of I go back and forth on how much I like jam bands.
Yeah,
you know what I mean. Like there's some that I find really interesting. The Modest Mouse have always and they've done jammy songs all throughout their career, even in some of the later albums. You'll hear that. Like Strangers to Ourselves even has some almost jammy elements to parts of it and stuff like that. One of the things that I've always enjoyed about how Modest Mouse does it is they always find a way to make it even more interesting as time goes on. So like even if it gets to like a 10-minute point, you're still like, I want to keep listening to this.
Well, yeah, like something like I always think about Ohio.
Yeah, Ohio is.
And like how and it's that sort of the weird, and it goes on for a while. I think he does it a lot in the song. My memory might be a little bad because I did listen through most of these albums in preparation for this, and I did listen to this one in particular. But this album doesn't quite sync to my memory banks as some of the other ones for some reason. But it is something I've listened to excessively at some point, and I remember his sort of the shouting of Ohio being this like sort of driving force of the song. And I think he does it quite a bit.
But then it goes into like this really beautiful like melody where he's almost singing, like you could almost this is where I kind of actually somewhat agree with you about I could see this being like almost like the rough prototype of Modest Mouse to come, where it sounds like it's on its way to becoming something more catchy, but it's not quite there yet. So this is definitely still, make no mistake, this is still a band in its development. You can definitely tell that this is the first record. The only pre-existing album would be the EP, The Fruit That Ate Itself, and then also Sad Sappy Sucker, which got shelved. But anyway, there's just so many good songs. It's definitely a lengthy record. The first two Modest Mouse records in particular, have such a different sound than the later Modest Mouse. And we'll get into that as we go on.
So I do want to move on because I don't want to talk about this album too long because it is kind of we had to keep moving on. But I think the one song for me personally that kind of signals that this band is special and that there's something, especially when you know more is coming, because you can't really listen to this album with fresh ears anymore because you know they have a whole discography behind them now. But Talking Shit About a Pretty Sunset is actually one of my favorite songs of theirs. Mm-hmm. There's something about it that just kind of, as obtuse and weird and as sort of almost confrontational and aggressive as the band can be, and you don't think of them as a band that really tugs at your heartstrings too much, but that song does something to me. It hits me in my core somewhere, and it's beautiful. It's the first time I would say that I would call the first song of theirs that I would truly call it beautiful. At this point, although I mean this album was released in April of '96, and Interstate 8 came out in August, so you do get stuff like Edit the Sad Parts and whatnot later coming up very soon. So the band is definitely going through a fruitful development. Mm-hmm. Anyway, let's move on to 1997's The Lonesome Crowded West, and this is the big one. This is the big one
for me, folks. This has become my favorite album of all time, not because it's a perfect record, because it's not, but that's exactly what makes it perfect, man. The first time that I put it on, I was puzzled. I didn't even know what I was listening to. I mean, seriously, because I had been into the Pixies, I had been into the Fugazi, and I'd been into punk rock for quite some time. And here's this guy who's just like screaming about like shopping malls and Orange Julius's and all this stuff. And what's really interesting is like they actually recently, Pitchfork a couple years ago, did a documentary about Lonesome Crowded West and the making of it. And you had mentioned that you, Jeff, that you wanted to watch that. Yeah, highly recommend it.
Well, I've seen it. I have seen it a number of when it came out or so. But what I wanted to rewatch, I kind of wanted to rewatch it in preparation for this, although I unfortunately didn't get around to it.
Sure.
And it's not very long. It's 45 minutes.
Yeah, it's like 45 minutes long.
So like I might end up revisiting it very soon.
That documentary really made me look at this record in even a different light even, which I didn't think was possible because I had already set in stone that this is a record that, of all the records that's ever been put out, this is the one that I wish. I'm jealous that somebody else wrote these songs besides me. You know what I mean? Like, but Teeth Like God's Shoeshine from the get-go is like the most intense opener that I can, and it's one of the most puzzling. But
the tempo shifts.
I mean, it's like almost 7 minutes long.
It's got multiple parts.
And the sound of it. I mean, at times the guitar sounds like it's just struggling to stay in tune. I mean, it's just really the way that the clanky drums, but it all works so good.
I have a funny sort of term I have for almost this album in general.
Yeah.
And this isn't meant to be condescending or anything, but this album, to me, I would call it a white trash opera in a way.
It's very, like, you can tell that Isaac Brock was going through some shit in his mind with this record. I mean, the lyrics, as far as I'm concerned, are Isaac Brock at perhaps his arguably highest point. I mean, on some of these songs, Heart Cooks Brain, right after Teeth Like God's Shoeshine, right after the full-on assault, where you're just left like, I mean, literally, I think my jaw was open for probably like 2 minutes into Heart Cooks Brain, because I was still trying to get over
what you just heard.
What I just heard on Teeth Like God's Shoeshine. It was like, I don't know, the best way to describe it is almost like a mutated Pixies. Like Pixies on steroids. if they like started like delving into like, you know, like Americana or like country music or something, but then all of a sudden it goes into this really down tempoed, Heart Cook's Brain, which is a very repetitive bass line, and that actually sounds even more like the Pixies than the first song. And I don't mean to compare them to the Pixies because they're a totally different thing.
Well,
but there is that context going on here.
The Pixies comparison actually, for me, makes a lot of sense. And actually, because critically, if you're going to go, like, because especially when I was getting into music, I've always wanted to sort of be a rock journalist in my life. It's been a thing. So I do read. I hit not as much as I used to, but I was really upset. I would obsessively read things like Rolling Stone, Spin, Pitchfork for a while. It was just Pixies comparisons. So you're not wrong.
Right.
And I don't know if it's because there's this sort of indie jangle going on.
Yeah.
And then there's the sort of aggressive, sort of weirdly similar vocal styles of Isaac Brock and Frank Black,
yes.
Black Francis,
Black
whatever
Francis,
he called himself.
Yeah. There's a lot of loud, quiet, loud dynamic on this record, too. More so than any other Modest Mouse release. This record is definitely the Modest Mouse at their rawest, I would say. Just like they were just getting down to the nitty-gritty with some of this stuff. I mean, and, you know, the lyrics, like I mentioned, just unbelievable. Bankrupt on Selling.
Bankrupt on Selling is another kind of ballady track. It's a ballad.
Yes.
If you want to call it a ballad, that would be, and it kind of similar to when I went off my jumping point with Edit the Sad Parts and talking shit about A Pretty Sunset. Bankrupt on Selling, I would put up there with the best of sort of the Modest Mouse hits you right in the heart.
Absolutely. I mean, just that one line that always got me was the line about college. I mean, just
go to college, learn some big words,
and I'll talk real loud. Goddamn right, I'll be heard. And you'll remember the guy who said all those big words he must have learned in college. Then there's also like on the song Lounge Closing Time, which that sounds like Talking Heads on steroids.
It's got a kind of a weird, kind of funky...
Yeah, like a funky sort of thing going on. But like, just another example of how Isaac Brock's lyrics make the simple complicated is, I've got a girlfriend out of the city. I know I love her. I think she's pretty. But it's like the way that he's singing it is so like...
It sounds like a kid.
Desperate.
Almost. He sounds like a teenager.
Yeah, he sounds like a teenager. And then...
I don't know how old he was at the time.
And then Cowboy Dan, that one part. Now, one thing about Cowboy Dan is, of course, my name is Dan. So the people who knew this album and knew this song specifically were always singing it about me. But I gotta tell you, man, Cowboy Dan provides one of the most powerful visuals of any song I've ever heard, and that is that's where he's like standing in the tall grass. You just picture this lonesome guy, you know, just walking through like some big open area, and just like
he's this lonely, angry man with a rifle.
Yeah, with a rifle. And, like, I mean, Isaac paints that so vividly, what he's going for. And, like, you really do, like, picture, like, an angry dude.
I picture a man whose truck has stalled in the middle of, like, just a stretch of lonely road, kind of what you'd see even in Iowa, you know. Yeah, we have so many back roads. His truck stops. He can't get the truck started. He freaks out, storms out of the truck, wanders around, fires his rifle in the air. Yeah. That's kind of what images that I'm getting.
And then all of a sudden, then Isaac Brock will kind of drift off and start going off on these like philosophical sort of tirades where all of a sudden then he moves from that, explaining like, you know, this huge like visual picture you have of this guy all of a sudden to like, every time you think you're talking, you're just moving your mouth. Every time you think you're walking, you're just moving the ground. And then you have to stop and think about those things for a minute before you know it. One of the greatest things that Isaac Brock did, especially with this record, he sang a lot about characters on this record. I noticed this. And he would almost take on the persona of that character towards the end of in this song in particular, towards the end of this song, like he sounded like he was the angry cowboy all of a sudden. I mean, the guitar started to just get heavier. He started to scream. Trailer Trash is another one that just
it's a really beautiful
do
song.
not understand, but the subject matter is it's very heartbreaking because it almost, I don't know, somebody described it to me once as like these are the things that you would be talking about at your high school reunion if like you just were not able to aspire to live your dreams. And it's kind of true. I don't know if that's what Isaac Brock meant when he wrote these songs, but it definitely has that sort of like, again, sort of hopelessness to it. But it's such
can be applied to that setting.
Yeah, it's just such a beautiful. And then Convenient Parking, Doing the Cockroach. Those are both just.
I really really enjoy Doing the Cockroach a lot.
Oh man, so good.
I really like the line in Doing the Cockroach. I was in heaven, I was in hell, believe in neither, but fear them as well.
Yeah.
Which makes a ton of sense because the concepts of heaven and hell are so ingrained into our culture. And if you're an atheist or agnostic, you don't necessarily believe they exist, but the idea is still frightening to you.
Well, and I think a lot of atheists, deep down inside, maybe, I don't know, because I'm personally not an atheist, but maybe there's still this sort of idea that, okay, well, maybe it is true.
I'll explain from my perspective. So I consider myself a Buddhist, but I don't believe in a deity. I'm essentially an atheist who meditates, essentially. I mean, I don't really know how I feel about the whole reincarnation business. I think for me there might be some scientific weight to that, but I don't want to get into that. Either way, I don't believe in a deity. I don't believe in a god. I don't believe in an afterlife, really, like in a heaven sense. But I think there's that part of everyone that wishes, no matter how much you don't believe in it, that you still wish for a place like heaven. You wish it exists. Like you kind of want it to exist because it sounds, nobody likes the idea of when I'm dead, I'm dead.
Sure.
Nobody really wants that. I don't think, people, it's a hard thing to grasp that when I'm not conscious anymore, I'm gone and that's it. It's a very hard thing, and it's not a comfortable thing to think about. And so, like, I personally, I still think that when I'm dead, my consciousness is dead. I'm dead.
Right.
It's over. But that doesn't mean I don't want to believe. I wish I could believe in a place like heaven.
Sure.
I really wish I could. I can't personally. Like, for me, I can't. There's fear. I think that conjures up that fear, and that's kind of what I get from it, for me personally, as somebody who is a non-theistic person.
Sure. One thing that I also want to point out, see, this is the type of conversation that a record like this conjures up.
Yes.
But anyway, one thing I also wanted to point out, I mentioned the documentary, and I want to kind of touch a little bit on how that documentary kind of changed my view of this record. At the very first song, there's this line where, there's this reoccurring line on that song where Isaac Brock talks about thick syrup standing in lines. Let's all have another Orange Julius. I don't think it's not in that order, but anyway, there's a lot of stuff about, in that song in particular, there's a lot of stuff about malls. Well, it turns out that when Isaac Brock was writing this album, the town he was living in, that him and Eric Judy and Jeremiah Green were from, was kind of on the brink of being like remodeled into sort of like a touristy shopping town. So it was like the way that Isaac Brock describes it in the documentary is he saw the cute little town that he was that he grew up in go from being like, like just this really cool mom and pop sort of town to being what he called mall fucked. All of a sudden you had all these mom and pop stores kind of going out of business because all these like big time corporations were setting up shop. And you see that happen around America quite a bit.
The Walmart effect, almost.
The Walmart effect, exactly.
Yeah. That's what I dubbed it. I don't know if that's
the town that we grew up in, Muscatine, is very, very much a good example of this.
Oh, yeah.
So a lot of this record is about that. And I didn't really realize that, but when you actually start, kind of looking into Isaac Brock's lyrics all throughout this album, you start to realize that really makes sense.
Absolutely. And I want to move forward now because we've talked about this album a lot.
Mm-hmm. Sorry, Jeff.
No. This is an album we could do an entire episode
Yes.
on this particular record. And so for me, that was my second favorite and his number one.
Number one.
So definitely high esteem from both of us. Check it out if you haven't. Influential record on indie rock in general.
Yes.
So anyway, now it wasn't until 2000 that the band signed with Epic Records, Sony.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if they were owned by Sony at the time, but they are now. So the big this is when a band goes corporate, sometimes there's an effect on their music.
Sure.
There's sellout shouts and
Sure.
So 2000s, The Moon and Antarctica. I want to kind of open this one up because it's my favorite Modest Mouse record.
It's your number one.
It's my number one.
Your number
And
one.
again, I could just go on about how much I love this album.
Mm-hmm.
I put it up there with Radiohead's OK Computer and all these kind of pristine, perfect, beautiful albums. For me, it is they signed to Epic Records. They have it's like a proper polished record, which some people might call anti the band or anti punk or whatever. But I have a soft spot for albums that are beautiful. And going back to that sort of icy dynamic that we talked about with the first two records, it's cold, it's chilly, it's the Moon and Antarctica. This album feels like a work of art to me. It feels like it has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And it flows almost perfectly. There is literally nothing about this album the only thing, maybe What People Are Made Of, the final track, sounds almost like a sort of an epilogue, maybe.
Yeah.
Because it doesn't really fit. It's this kind of rough blast of raw energy at the very end of the record, which doesn't really fit with the rest of it. That's probably the only thing that kind of doesn't fit to me, but it does make sense that it's at the very end as this weird epilogue to the rest of it, which it's this kind of you move through almost this cold, distant, glaciary, almost there is that, for example, if we want to kind of tie back into the city dynamic, a different city. He talks about how he wants to live in the city with no friends and family. He wants to look out the window of his color TV. It's a very rough, it's a powerful song about feeling alone in the middle of a populated area, which is very common in city life. You can feel lonely even when you're surrounded by people. And I could go on. I do want to point out that, especially when you get through to After a Different City, with the cold part, Alone Down There, and The Stars Are Projectors, and then it's this it feels like three parts to a whole piece of music. Those three songs seg together so well in such a beautiful manner that they feel like their own act. It feels like an act of a play. It's really hard to describe and then it kind of gives you this breath of fresh air when Wild Packs of Family Dogs comes in and sort of kind of little acoustic weird thing that comes in that kind of it's still dark. It talks about dogs eating people, but it's still like a weird. It sort of you get a breath after something as kind of epic and lengthy as the stars are projectors. It's I could go on and on about this record, and I want you to weigh in.
Yeah, I mean, well, this is my second favorite Modest Mouse record, and the reason why it is because besides all the reasons you just listed, it feels like a complete work of art. It really does. You couldn't ask now. I got to admit that and I think most Modest Mouse fans from the 90s were maybe a little bit hesitant about, oh yeah, they're going to be signing to a major label, so is this going to affect their sound? It did affect their sound. You're damn right. But you know what it did? It made their sound. Now their sound was great on the indie labels, but in this case, you couldn't ask for a better major label debut. I actually don't know how this album was so kind of just went so unnoticed, really. I mean, it wasn't a commercial success. I guess maybe part of the reason why is because it is a complete album. And there really isn't a lot of...
it lacks a hit.
Poppiness, exactly.
Yeah. The closest thing to that might be the first couple of tracks. Gravity Rides Everything could definitely be
I would say even A Different City, I could see just with that ding, ding, that sort of catchy guitar part. But yeah, it doesn't have like a poppy structure to it at all.
Paper Thin Walls is kind of catchy.
Paper Thin Walls definitely has its moment, and again, some of the best lyrics.
So that's also kind of a city one. Paper Thin Walls or Paper Thin.
I'm really glad that you mentioned the cold part, Alone Down There, and The Stars Are Projectors, because that's actually my favorite part of the entire record is those three songs.
Perfect.
The Stars Are Projectors in particular. For some reason, when CMJ released the compilation CD, because you all remember CMJ Magazine, right? CMJ Magazine was a sort of an indie magazine that they would put out every month. It actually came with a CD of all the new releases that are coming out that month. They actually decided, and usually if it's like a major label debut or something like that, they would put like the catchiest song. No, they put Stars Are Projectors, which is just an insane introduction. Right away, I was super impressed and super excited because I'm like, wow. Like, yeah, it definitely sounds a lot more polished, and it is a lot more polished. But Modest Mouse are not really moving away from their insaneness that made them that made them great on their first two records. The only thing different on this record is just the production quality, which is a lot better than the first two records. Third Planet just blows my mind. Once again, in a different way than, like, say, that of Teeth Like God's Shoeshine. Lyrically, I mean, that song is just insane. The Third Planet is sure that they're being watched by an eye in the sky. Just that line alone. And just the way that he, like, almost... he's almost, like, rapping or something, like, just the way that he's kind of reciting, like, well, a third is just the main. We were swimming in the water. I can't even remember what the actual lyrics are there, but he's almost doing like a folk rap during that part. Like, it really sounds interesting. And then my favorite, What People Are Made Of. You touched on that.
Yeah.
I think that song sounds like sort of something that Isaac Brock maybe had laying around that he was maybe going to put on Lonesome Crowded West, and then decided, you know what, screw it. Let's just put it on this record. We'll just make it the last track, which maybe that wasn't the intent at all, but it's definitely the punkiest that this album gets.
It definitely feels like an ender, though. It
does.
Because I think if it were to end, say, on Life Like Weeds, it wouldn't be as... And Life Like Weeds is a beautiful song.
It is a great.
I don't know how well, I don't know if that feels like an ending, personally. Compared to What People Are Made Of. Like, it doesn't feel quite like an ending.
And Alone Down There. My gosh.
Oh.
That's just like...
I want...
that's one of the most terrifying sounding songs from Modest Mouse.
Claustrophobic.
Yeah, just really, it sounds like somebody screaming for help. I mean, it's just, it's so good. And then Gravity Rides Everything was actually featured in a beer commercial. Did you know that?
I think I had heard it was in a commercial of some kind, which again goes kind of the commercialism. I don't have an issue with bands selling their music for advertising. It doesn't. Some people hate it. It doesn't bother me. I mean, it's true. Everyone has to make a buck. Like the Black Keys sell tons of their music to ads, and lots of groups do it. I think if you're still making quality music, I don't care if it sells records. I mean, I'm a pop music person anyway, so it's fine.
Well, this is the kind of stuff that I want to hear on the radio.
It's stuff that should get more exposure.
This is the kind of stuff that these are the people that when I was listening to Lonesome Crowded West, I kept saying, why isn't this stuff huge? You know what I mean?
That could have been like a, I don't know. You get into that sort of if it's too popular thing, but whatever. One of my favorite. I love the Beatles,
Sure.
And I love all sorts of really. Modest Mouse is a big popular band now.
They are. They're a popular band. They're gonna be. I mean, that's just, that's what they are. You can either have them, struggling to eat, or you can have them actually making a living off their music.
Which we all strive to make a living off of something we love doing.
And the whole thing about using like somebody's music for a commercial or something like that, you can't really like comment on that unless you're in that situation. I don't.
For sure. I also wanted to point out, I do want to move on because we do need to keep pushing through the rest of the albums. I wanted to point out, because it's a major label, it's pretty sounding, it glistens almost. It's sort of shiny. It does have like a very icy, shiny glisten to it in a lot of ways, especially like Gravity Rides Everything, but they haven't really lost their weirdness either.
No.
I wanted to point out like I mentioned, Wild Packs of Family Talks and this sort of dogs taking people away and eating them sort of business, but Tiny Cities Made of Ashes is kind of one of the weirdest, sort of funkiest little jams they have, and some of the weird sort of effects that are on that song, the when he's screaming, and the sort of, I want to hit you on your face, I want to punch you with your glasses. And it's weird. It's bizarre.
It really puts me in mind of a more well-rounded version of like Convenient Parking or something.
Yeah, definitely.
It has that sort of funky. Once in a while, it seems like on just about every Modest Mouse record, there's at least a funk number.
Yeah, there is a little bit of a funk on some of their stuff, oddly enough, for being a pretty, pasty indie northwest sort of group.
Sure.
Not really known for funk. But anyway, so let's transition to this one. I keep wanting to say, the big one. Well, commercially,
it's the big one.
This is the big one. Commercially, this is their peak as far as radio hit and sort of visibility in the public eye, the sort of mainstream public eye. Good news for people who love bad news.
This is.
I love that album title.
It's
I've always loved
great
it.
album title, and it's such a Modest Mouse album title.
It's a weird play on words to play on.
Yeah. Every Modest Mouse album title is pretty amazing, except for I'm gonna say one I'm not too crazy about, but we'll get to that.
So anyway, so Good News. I put that in higher esteem on my list than you did, although we did flip it kind of.
And that by no means is the only reason why I did that, in all honesty, because this is number 4 on my list, right under. Honestly, this could have been number 3, and the only reason why I did that is just because I have such a connection to Long Drive, but I don't think this is any worse of a record than the first 3 on my list. As a matter of fact, I think for all the people that have to make a record that has a single on it, whether it's, for all the bands that are on a label saying, and maybe they're getting pressure, maybe this was pressure from the label, maybe Isaac Brock and Modest Mouse were just in the mood to kind of go a little poppy with it. I don't know. Folks, there's nothing wrong with pop music when it's done right. This is like totally an example. This is a perfect example. If you're going to make a record that's going to sell records and you have to do it, whether you have to or you just want to, I mean, ladies and gentlemen, study this record, because this among many others, like, I don't know, Weezer's The Blue Album, Jimmy Eat World's Bleed American, I think, is another good example of that. Dookie,
Green Day.
These are records that do it right. And I'm not saying this isn't a diss on pop music in general, but I'm saying that, like, being from the background that all these bands that we just mentioned are from, except maybe Weezer, because the Blue Album was actually their debut. But Jimmy Eat World was from the punk emo scene. Green Day, of course, the punk scene. Modest Mouse, of course, probably even more so than any of these bands, is from the underground rock scene period.
The indie.
This record is breathtaking, ladies and gentlemen. I mean, it starts off with a horn intro for 9 seconds, which is really funny. I don't know what the
the horn intro definitely. Well, that's a foreshadow of oh Jesus, is it This Devil's Workday, or is that, which is the other one with the is it
The Devil's Workday? That's it. Yeah.
Yeah, the Dirty Dozen.
The one that really sounds like Tom Waits. Like, it really sounds like Tom Waits.
The Dirty Dozen brass band that play horns on this album. That's kind of their.
Sort of like their, yeah. And
so yeah, there's a whole horn group on this album.
It goes into The World at Large, which is just a beautiful song. Float On, which is like one of the best things ever on the radio in the past probably 10 years.
That's kind of what I wanted to actually I want to elaborate a little more on Float On, because that's kind of what you were talking. You were talking about Float On, right?
Yeah, pretty much.
When you were talking about how to produce a pop single.
A pop single, yes.
And you're sort of an indie rock, sort of a weird band that does that most people would write off as being not commercial.
Right.
Float On is kind of how you do it.
Yes.
It's a great number, and it was my, like I had mentioned before, it was my introduction to the band. Float On was the first Modest Mouse song I'd ever heard, because it was everywhere.
You're not alone in that.
Well, yeah.
Jeff. I mean,
of course.
The Float On was a lot of people's introduction, and it was my reintroduction to the band, because I think I had actually, like, fallen off and not listened to Modest Mouse much for a little while, and then I heard this, and I was like, wow, these guys are still putting out great music. It excited me.
This is also talking about gateways to other bands, mainstream pop singles and big label albums that get critical praise and radio play tend to be gateways to other bands. We've name-dropped the Pixies. We've name-dropped Tom Waits. Had I not heard Float On as a teenager, because I was learning still. I didn't, from reading reviews and being passionate, I found out Pixies, I found out who the Pixies were, and I found out who Tom Waits was through Modest Mouse. It was literally because somebody compared This Devil's Workday in like a Rolling Stone article, or some critic said this is like a Tom Waits song.
Yeah.
I went and I looked up Tom Waits online, and I looked up who he was, and I listened to some of his music.
Sure.
And I fell in love with him. I love Tom Waits.
Sure.
Which he might be another one coming up in the future.
Man.
But there's a lot. But yeah, Modest Mouse. Good news for people who love bad news. Float On. It's incredible. This has some of my favorite Modest Mouse songs on it.
Mine too, actually.
Bukowski.
Bukowski is a phenomenal one. One of my favorites is Black Cadillacs.
Black Cadillacs. And that's Black Cadillacs is also one of those very like Pixies-esque sort of.
Very much so.
And it has it has a booming chorus. It's a catchy chorus. And it does have this sort of like, it kind of it does kind of have a like the quiet, loud, quiet dynamic of the choruses that always stuck out to me.
Also really like Bury Me With It. That one kind of takes you back to when Brock was an angry young lad on Teeth Like God's Shoeshine for a minute.
Well, it also, actually, there's a fun connection with, I think, Bury Me With It and Teeth Like God's Shoeshine, in that I think there's a sense of consumerism and commercialism in that, where he's talking about how he wants to be buried with his possessions, while Teeth Like God's Shoeshine talks about the shopping malls and the kind of increasing capitalistic tendencies, which is interesting because this is their most like capitalistic
record. Yeah. And then the second single, Ocean Breeze Salty, which performed well on the radio, just as good as Float On did, if not. I probably like that song even better than Float On.
It's definitely the less commercial.
Such an amazing song, but it's still very catchy. I actually think there's quite a few songs on this that could have been hits. I mean, Black Cadillacs could have been a single, I think. It's just so... The other thing that I want to point out, Modest Mouse on the first 3 records were not particularly known for being a band that made you feel good.
No.
This record, on the other hand, is like the best sunny weather listening music. Now, the lyrics are still pretty dark.
Oh, yeah.
And pretty depressing. The sound of it, though, it really puts me in mind of like, sort of like a, at times almost like it doesn't have the same sound, but the same sort of approach and aesthetic as like something like They Might Be Giants, because it doesn't sound like They Might Be Giants, but They Might Be Giants are a band that writes very dark lyrics but makes music that sounds very sunny and very like, you know, like you're singing along and then you realize that like what you're singing along about is like being dead, like on the dead by They Might Be Giants. A lot of that is kind of going on with this record. However, Float On, though, there does seem to be quite a lot of hope in that song.
Yeah, Float On has a very optimistic...
optimistic. I mean, he talks about backing his car into a cop car. If that would have been Lonesome Crowded West...
It would have been just
Brock,
a pure
he would have
anger.
just screamed.
Yeah.
He would have screamed about how he backed into a cop car.
It's a very, like, all right, already, we'll all float on. We'll get over it.
Yeah.
We'll get through it.
It kind of makes me wonder if, like, because a lot of the other songs...
He's older, too, you know.
Yeah, he's older. A lot of the other songs do, like Bukowski, I mean, he talks about how could anyone be such an asshole when he's...
So is he talking about Bukowski himself, or is he talking about, because he says something about God and God being a control
He probably
freak.
is talking more about God, but that brings forth the fact that like
there's a lot of religion in this.
There's a lot of religion in this album as well, which there is a lot of religion in the other Modest.
Oh yeah, that's
too.
a touch. That's Ocean Breed Salty.
So Isaac Brock is still pretty much, with the exception of Float On, pretty much writing about the same type of stuff. Good Times Are Killing Me. There's a lot of darkness on this record that's kind of hidden in plain sight.
I have a good comparison, a great comparison piece to this. An analogy, sort of. Nevermind.
Yeah.
Nirvana's Nevermind is there. It's a very similar idea in that they're still singing about the same stuff, but it's more polished. It's catchier. It's more accessible. I've actually thought about this
from Bleach to Nevermind.
From Bleach to Nevermind, or just there's this.
That's a good comparison. The only major difference that I would say between like that and the Modest Mouse is that with Nirvana, even though like the songs on Nevermind were way more well polished and definitely poppier, the music still sounded kind of
rough.
Yeah, it still sound like if that record was produced by the same guy, Jack Endino, who did Bleach, it would sound like another Nirvana record. You know what I mean?
That's very true.
Whereas this record is like, I mean, you can take the music. If you took the vocals of Isaac Brock out of this record and put it next to Teeth Like God's Shoeshine, it would sound like two completely different bands.
Yeah, that's also true. And then, I mean, I didn't mean it as a straight direct comparison, because Modest Mouse have had years of development and growth when Nevermind was Nirvana's second album.
Yeah, it was their second record. You're exactly right. No, and that wasn't like, because I agree with you. I think that I just wanted to point that out too, because Modest Mouse were around a lot longer than Nirvana.
It was more of this is dark subject matter against a sort of catchy production is kind of
Sure.
what I was getting at.
Okay,
With
yeah.
that comparison is, I guess,
Gotcha.
what I meant.
Got you.
Because like Nirvana's like,
I guess I was still thinking of They Might Be Giants in my head.
because like Nirvana's Nevermind is catchy. It's so catchy,
Very catchy.
but it's dark. It's Nirvana. It's
yeah,
dark. It's
very
angsty.
catchy.
It's
Yeah.
Pixies was also another one with Nirvana
Dookie.
and Dookie. God, Dookie is so depressing. If you
Yeah,
listen
it
to the
is.
lyrics,
It really is. I mean, like Burnout. I mean, yeah.
yeah,
That's for another podcast.
Green Day coming up soon, I'm sure. But you know, tracks like The View, The Good Times Are Killing Me, are
The View
catchy,
is-
sunny sounding tracks.
What's your favorite track off this one, Jeff?
I don't want to sound like I have I'm a ballady guy, but maybe I am. I don't know, because Blame It on the Tetons.
It's a great one.
God, it kind of it really hits me.
I also really like that interlude. It just sounds really
With
nice.
like the crying, is that the baby? The baby, I think.
Crying.
Yeah,
Like, there's just something about that one. I'm gonna have to say that my favorite one off this one is Black Cadillacs, but I would have to say that Bury Me With It is a close second, and The World at Large.
You notice how I always kind of Bury Me With It and Satin in a Coffin to me kind of almost are like sister songs.
They
because
are.
They're
They
very
are.
they're very similar in a lot of ways.
The World at Large is another
That's a
favorite
gorgeous
of mine. I love
song.
that song. That's such a good opener.
I think The World at Large might be my second favorite.
and it's
on
the
album.
perfect song to come after the horn intro.
Another gateway for me was I believe the Flaming Lips are on The Good Times Are Killing Me.
They are.
I don't know if it's the full band or if it's just.
I think it's just.
It's the
Flaming Lips.
They
give
provide the
additional
entire instrument.
And you know what else happened after this record? Man, I kicked myself for missing it, because I think this tour actually came to either the Quad Cities or somewhere like Cedar Rapids, but it was a tour that Flaming Lips did with Cake,
Ooh, I like Cake.
De La Soul,
Ooh,
Modest Mouse,
jeez.
and then I can't remember who the opener was. The opener was like one of those bands that kind of was big at the time around this sort of like indie rock sort of resurgence thing that was going on. But
I want to get into
fell,
that too. I want to actually get into that because this is perfect for me.
The indie rock.
Yeah. The revival, if you will. Sorry, do you need to continue that? Or
No, not
Sorry.
at all. I was just saying that like
you missed the two.
one of the things that I would have loved to have seen at that time, and I didn't know this because I didn't go into the De La Soul catalog very much until like recently, but I would have loved to have seen De La Soul hold their own again, do the rap thing in the middle of all these like awesome, amazing indie rock, because De La Soul, that might be another one that I'd want to do.
And I haven't really explored De La Soul, so it would be something I'd like to
What
experience.
about Tribe Called Quest? Are you familiar with them?
Oh yeah, I've been digging on. Actually, this year alone, I've been really digging Tribe.
We should do a Tribe one.
Yeah,
too.
I've had actually the debut, People's Instinctive Travels, whatever it's a long
Great
title.
record.
I've been listening to that on repeat lately.
I love Tribe, but I'm maybe this is a minority, I don't know, but like De La Soul, I think I like even more.
I'm gonna have to check out De La Soul.
Super good.
Gateway, going back to the whole Modest Mouse is my gateway drug, if you will, which is funny because The Good Times Are Killing Me is about partying and drugs, about kind of just being kind of old and beaten up by drug addiction,
Right.
but in a kind of sunny way, in almost a nostalgic way, it almost feels like, but I didn't know who the Flaming Lips were until I found out they were on this record. I had no idea. I didn't know Tom Waits. I didn't know who the Pixies were until I listened to Modest Mouse. It really was, this record especially was a gateway for me into a new world. I mean, it wasn't my first, like, it's when critics start comparing all these, like, bands that came prior, sort of your Pixies were the big prototype for modern indie in a lot of ways. Pixies, because like I discovered the Velvet Underground because they were name dropped in Strokes reviews. Yeah, going 2003, 2004, 2005 for me as a teenager, as a 13, 14, 15-year-old, 16-year-old, was a huge time for music for me. You had the garage rock revival that kind of went into this like post-punk indie. When you had the White Stripes, the Strokes, the Hives, Interpol, the Killers, Modest Mouse, Franz Ferdinand. You had all of these bands getting huge.
Queens of the Stone Age.
Queens of the Stone Age had sort of a big following before this, but they definitely were part of that scene, though, because they were huge around this time. They're still huge.
Yeah.
But they had dropped like Lullabies to Paralyze, I think, around that time, which was a killer album.
Yeah.
I listened to that because of all the stuff I was getting exposed to.
Yeah.
And then you had sort of your lesser known, like, kind of more generic-y. You did have the sort of like Kaiser Chiefs, they're a fun band. And like the Editors, which were kind of an Interpol clone. Things like that, which are still really, actually, I still really enjoy the Black Room by the Editors to this day. But anyway, I'm going on a tangent a little bit, but if you wanted to call an album influential to a generation of music fans, this would be one of them. This would be like my Dookie or my Nevermind in a way.
For sure.
Although part of that I want to kind of maybe, for a Jack White Stripes show, I would mention Elephant. Elephant is an album that was a gateway for me as well. The Elephant was my like wake up call.
Elephant probably was even bigger than this album.
Yeah, Elephant, I think, sold more copies than this album. I think Elephant was a big seller than this one.
Album.
Elephant was my Nevermind. This might have been my Dookie, in a way. We'll say that. Because, like, I'm sure people who heard Nevermind got into Dookie not too long after, probably, because it came out a little bit later, a few years later. Anyway, we want to move forward now. We've been talking a lot, and that's great. That's what this is about. 2007... We Were Dead Before the Ship Even Sank. And I wanted to read this because I mentioned this to you earlier, but they originally apparently envisioned this as a concept album about a boat crew that dies in every song, which I thought adds a really fun dimension to. And it does have a weird, like, nautical theme.
It does.
Even with the album art.
That reminds me of every episode of C-Lab 2021. I wonder if Isaac Brock was watching that show a lot when this came out. I guess this was 2007, so it would have been past the heyday of when Adult Swim was still sort of, I guess, underground or whatever.
This is the one album, well, one of the two albums that we rank exactly the same.
Yeah.
So this is kind of similar in our esteem.
Yeah.
Let's talk about, we also want to bring up the Smiths guitarist Johnny Marr.
Yeah, Johnny Marr.
Who does add a dimension to this record.
He does add something to the record. I'm not sure if it was entirely necessary, but for whatever reason, the band did, or maybe the management did, or maybe it was the label. I don't know. I know Isaac Brock himself stated that he wasn't really a big Smiths fan.
It does seem like a weird fit. It's very different.
It is very weird. Can you imagine how many angry Smiths fans there probably were that were just like, why does Modest Mouse get Johnny Marr in their band if he's not even a Smiths fan? Because Smiths is one of those bands that the people who are fans of the Smiths are like fanatical about them. You know, like I know a few Smiths fans, and they're really like almost defensive about the Smiths. Because I'm not really a huge Smiths fan myself.
I really like the Smiths. I do enjoy the Smiths a lot.
Yeah.
But it's another one of those bands that's kind of like in my radar, but not really.
Yeah.
I had gotten like a compilation CD, Louder Than Bombs, I think is
Louder
the name.
Than Bombs, yeah.
And I listened through it a couple of times. I found it at a Goodwill, I think, and back in like the day, probably back when this album came out.
Yeah.
And I really dug it. I dig the songwriting. Sleep is a gorgeous song. And like it's beautiful there. I love Morrissey's voice. I like the music.
He's got a really good voice.
But I just have not explored the Smiths discography, and I don't think it's very long.
I'm not even sure.
I don't know much about the Smiths.
I do know that Morrissey is at least from what I've read, is sort of like the Axl Rose of indie rock.
That sounds, from what I gather, as well.
Yeah, like
but
he really thinks he's something, and
the
does
Smiths,
a lot of not showing up to his gigs.
the Smiths and Morrissey might be another show. Who knows that we
It
could do in the
might be.
future?
Yeah, I mean, it would totally be like.
I might do it with somebody who's a big fan.
Yeah.
Because we want to get guests.
And I would actually, definitely.
We want guests.
And I would be willing to actually because you can find every album from the Smiths on YouTube or something.
I stream. Well, I pay for streaming. I pay for streaming. Apple.
Apple. Okay.
We're not promoting unless you want to give us money, Apple. Anyway, give us money. We'll promote.
We would love to have some dollars from your fruit company.
I do use a MacBook and I subscribe to Apple Music and I have an iPhone. I'm a whore.
Come on.
I am a whore. Fuck me.
You want to do it. Come
anyway,
on.
Now somebody's
that's
gonna cost me a job someday saying that on. Anyway, or get me a new job. So We Were Dead Before the Ship Even Sank is another album to me that does feel like a great cohesive whole album. It is a good album, and it is well produced, of course. Has some great... Modest Mouse is always good with guitar riffs, and there is that sort of... There is that jangly post-punk sound that Modest Mouse has had since the beginning that's still very present on this one.
Sure.
Florida... I love March into the Sea is actually one of my favorite Modest Mouse openers.
That is a great opener. I think that this album for me starts off really strong. I think Dashboard is
that guitar.
an amazing single.
It's a dance. It's got a danceable groove, but it's done in a.
It's almost like what we were talking about with Convenient Parking and what's that one on Moon in Antarctica?
Tiny Cities Made of Ashes.
Tiny Cities Made of Ashes. It's almost like they took that. They found a way to take that one token funk song and make it a hit. It's a great song. I would almost say that it may even rival Float On as being catchy.
It's certainly at least one of their. It's the Float On of this album.
Yeah, definitely.
It's the big single. It was a big hit. It was everywhere when it came out. It's got a great music video too, as well. It's another sea themed video. You've seen all the videos?
I've seen all the videos.
That's a great video.
I think the thing about this record that made me put it closer to the bottom is, while I agree with you, I do think that it is it does feel like a full piece of music. It does feel like there was some sort of concept or something that was sort of the sea holding it together. The sea theme. It does feel very nautical. My only gripe about the record really is that it, more so than past Modest Mouse releases, it's sort of almost... It's the first time that I could say that I felt maybe there was maybe a little bit of filler on a Modest Mouse record.
Yeah,
it sort of fell short to me. Let me put it to you this way: I listened to it all the way through from front to back, maybe a handful of times.
I've listened to it a lot, and
it's sort of there isn't as anything memorable to me about like. It's not. Some of the songs are just not as memorable as past Modest Mouse releases, and I don't know if that's maybe maybe they kind of like with Moon in Antarctica and Good News for People Who Love Bad News, they just got it right, man. Maybe this is the record that we were afraid they were gonna make when they made the major label. Because if this would have been the major label debut, I would have been really disappointed.
Yeah, it would have been.
It would have been a huge. It
would have been what you'd expect.
Exactly.
It would have been exactly what you would expect the band to do.
You know, it almost sounds like parts of the record, especially when it goes on. It almost feels like Isaac Brock is kind of losing some of his.
I do think it has some. There's still some bite on this record.
There is. Well, March into the Sea.
Parting of the Sensory is really cool.
I really like Fly Trapped in a Jar. I think that one is interesting.
Spitting Venom is also a really good one.
Spitting Venom, don't
Is
recall
Spitting
that
Venom
one.
the one that where? And I'm sorry, this is gonna sound if I'm inaccurate, I apologize. But because I think that's the one where he goes on the refrain about carbon, is where someday you may die somehow and something's gonna steal your carbon. I think that's the song.
Yeah, I
And
think it is.
I
think it
love
is.
that part. I love when
I think you're right.
it shifts into
Yeah,
that
yeah,
part.
that is
and that's
really
very
cool.
classic Modest Mouse. Actually, is what
It is very, very, yeah. And there's moments of classic Modest Mouse on this record.
Education.
This actually may have what's weird about this record is that, okay, one might argue, and there could be an argument for this, I'll admit this. For Lonesome Crowded West being my favorite album of all time, one could argue that there's a couple of songs that could be considered filler on that record.
That's true, yeah.
Shit Luck.
Shit Luck is definitely feels like
It's
a
an
filler.
awesome fucking
Feels like
song.
an interlude almost.
It does. It's an awesome song. Like, I love it, but I could see how one could say that that's filler. You know what I mean? So, but for some reason, that works. That sort of thing works on that record. Then, and this record almost feels, I don't know. To me, it just sort of feels.
I don't know if anything I'd consider direct filler on this, but I do think it is kind of because it is it's not the longest piece of music or album out there. It's about an hour, and it's. I would say, I wanted to hit on, okay, if we're going to talk about filler and we're going to talk about singles for the sake of singles,
Sure.
We've Got Everything sounds and it is catchy. It's extremely catchy, and the lyrics are kind of interesting because it's almost talking about man's man being pompous and arrogant and thinking we know everything, which is interesting in concept, but the song does sound like your generic indie post-punk song from the time period.
Actually, that's another
It's catchy, but it's not.
It is.
It's a single. It was a single, and it got some play.
That's another thing too. Is I almost feel like there are times where it almost feels like Isaac Brock's lyrics are not as, I guess, like, because the first 4 records, just about every song or most songs on the first 4 records had, some really, really amazing lyrics. Yeah.
I wanted to point out, when we're talking about lyrics, I actually really like the song Education. I mentioned that a little bit ago. Education does have the kind of vintage Modest Mouse. This is a nice little kind of parallel. You mentioned the going to college and learning big words line from Bankrupt on Selling, I believe. Education has the line of something about the book sat on the shelf looking much smarter than me. Do you I don't know if you remember that particular line.
No, and actually, I'm going to have to say that I'm going to have to listen to this album again because I don't actually recall the song.
You should have listened to it.
I know I should have.
I didn't.
I'm a busy man.
I admit I didn't actually revisit this album for the podcast.
Yeah, I didn't revisit.
I revisited a few. I revisited the first 3 albums.
Sure.
For this, and then just didn't go further because
Sure.
I know most of these pretty well, and I did revisit "Strangers to Ourselves" because honestly, I kind of forgot about it.
Yeah.
It doesn't hold. Which we're getting to.
That's kind of what I did. So.
Actually, why don't we seg into that now?
Yeah,
might as well.
Strangers to Ourselves.
Strangers to Ourselves, Modest Mouse's 6th studio album and their final studio album, released in 2015.
Well, hopefully it's not their final. I mean, I hope they come out with something more.
Their most recent album.
When did it come out?
2015.
So it's what? Wow, that's almost 8 years from. Well, they did have that EP, No One's First and You're Next.
Yeah, it has been a long, long way, and that's actually something I want to talk about. So, the longest gap between studio albums of Modest Mouse is from We Were Dead Before the Ship Even Sank to Strangers to Ourselves. And when I found out a new Modest Mouse album was coming out, I got hyped. I got excited. I was ready. It's been too long. And I think the wait hurt. I really think the wait hurt. I think it put more I had more hype, more expectations for this, more excitement because of the wait. and it's one of those things where the weight of the album, the length of time we spent waiting did not. If this album probably wouldn't have been as disappointing to me had it been released 2 years after, in 2009 or 10, after We Were Dead. It is number 6 on both of our lists for a reason.
Well, the reason why I put it on the list, I think there's some great songs on here. I mean, I really like Lampshades on Fire. I thought that was great. Shit in Your Cut was pretty cool. Trying to think here. Mm-hmm. And what is God is an Indian and You're an Asshole? I don't remember that one.
God is an Indian, because I just listened to the album. It's one of those that it's kind of it's almost like an interlude. It's really brief. It's not a full song.
The Ground Walks with Time in a Box is amazing.
That's got a great, oh my God, the guitar riff on that song.
That is a great. So there's some amazingness on this record, as there is with every Modest Mouse record, even like the last record, which for me was kind of underwhelming in comparison to the first 4. Overall, I think the reason why I put this on last on my list is because I'm not as familiar with it as I am with other Modest Mouse records, so I feel like it would be unfair to, I guess in a way it's kind of unfair to say that in that regards too, to say that it's my least favorite Modest Mouse record, although I think I kind of know that it would be anyway. But
most of it's... Oh, go ahead.
But I just feel... I got the feeling when I listened to it, because I've never... It's the only Modest Mouse release that I've never owned, with the exception of some really early, rarer stuff. But, like, I never owned, like, for example, the Blue Cadet, 7-inch or whatever. But what I got from listening to this record was a band that almost feels like they need to appease both new and old fans. And I think it works really well, because this record kind of reminded me of like sort of a meshing of old and new Modest Mouse, or at least an attempt to do that.
I can see that.
I think it works really well on songs like The Ground Walks with Time in a Box, but I think that it falls flat on a few others, which, again, I'm not even 100%.
Most of it blends together to me. Most of it doesn't really stand out.
Yeah, it doesn't stand out. And that was kind of my problem with We Were Dead also, to a lesser extent, is that there weren't a lot of memorable moments, as many memorable moments on that record as there was with the first 4, and certainly not on this one either.
I wanted to point out most of it's very mid-tempo. Most of it's very mid-tempo. Most of it's very kind of just meandering in a way. But, I mean, I did want to... I really like this song Sugar Boats. That's got this very cool circusy, almost like weird whimsical vibe to it, which I really dig. I think I really liked Sugar Boats a lot. I kind of want to... To me, I don't know if you recall this track. You should, but it's kind of the elephant in the room as far as songs on this album, but Pistol. Do you remember Pistol? It is like weird and almost electronic. It has this kind of bizarre, like we're trying to experiment feel to it.
Okay.
And actually, the first time I listened to the record, I hated it. I hated the song.
Hated it?
I thought it was... First time I'd say, "Oh, this song is stupid," is what I'd said. And I tried listening to it again recently, and I still don't really like it very much, but I think I appreciate that they were adding a bit of they were trying to do something a little different, adding a little flavor to the record that needs flavor. I would recommend going back and listening to Pistol, because and I was reading, I think online somewhere, it is kind of a divisive song.
So it's an electronic song?
Kind of, in a way.
Well, here's the thing that's interesting about Modest Mouse is Modest Mouse, and I forgot to mention this actually earlier about the EPs. They actually did a single with an electronic group in their early years.
You mentioned that,
764 Hero. I can't remember what the name of the single is. It's on the Wikipedia page. I actually owned it at one time. And I do know that Isaac Brock was actually like influenced by, as a lot of punk bands and indie bands from the 90s were bands like Kraftwerk and stuff like
Joy
that.
Division, New Order.
Joy Division, New Order. Some of the electronic sort of indie bands that, you know. And it's interesting because in the time that they were an indie band, they were getting praised for like kind of doing a track like that. So it's kind of interesting that, you know that, and maybe there's, it's interesting because they actually kind of have a history of dabbling and stuff like that a little bit, you know what I mean? And so I'm actually very curious to listen to it now. I don't really remember it, but you know, I wonder. Now I have a question for you, Jeff.
Yeah.
And I've been wondering this the whole time. I, of course, was introduced to Modest Mouse through Lonesome Crowded West. So I heard, for the longest time, Modest Mouse was a 3-piece, somewhat noisy punk band. But for you were introduced to Good News for People Who Love Bad News. And I always thought, when Good News for People Who Love Bad News came out, which I thought was a great record from the get-go, I remember getting it from the store. I bought it up in Iowa City at this place called Discount Records. Do you remember Discount Records?
I don't.
Anyway, I bought it and put it in, and I was like, this is great. This is awesome. Kids are going to be like into Modest Mouse now, right? But the thought that crossed my mind was, what the hell are they going to think if they do the same thing that I did with, like, say, Green Day, and I went back and got Kerplunk, and I went back and got 39 Smooth after Dookie came out? What the hell are they going to think when they buy Lonesome Crowded West? Because this totally does not sound a thing. So my question for you, Jeff, is what was your reaction when you first heard Lonesome Crowded West? Because it's so radically different from, I mean, I couldn't even imagine, like, you know, there were like girls, you know, that were like, you know, huge pop fans of, like, at the time, who was big at the time, like in the pop world, Gwen Stefani, for instance.
Yeah.
You know, Gwen Stefani was like.
But then again, you can make a whole argument about No Doubt there, going back and listening to No
Doubt. Well,
sure,
but yeah, no, that's true. But my point is that Gwen Stefani was being played on the radio next to Float On.
Or Britney Spears.
Britney Spears. So Float On was being played. So people who were fans of that kind of music were hearing Float On, and there's a very good chance, some of them went out and got Good News because they thought that was a great album.
Yeah.
And there's a chance that maybe some of them might have said, well, I'm going to buy this Lonesome Crowded West record. And so, you know, and that always intrigued me. So you being that kid who was introduced to Modest Mouse through Good News, what was your first reaction when you first heard Teeth Like God's Shoe Shine? You first heard the dear, dear, dear from the top of the ocean, you know, and then just...
So, my friend had played me a song from Lonesome Crowded West on his iPod, but it was actually one of the more tame songs from Lonesome Crowded West. It was Jesus Christ Was an Only Child.
Yeah,
and that song's pretty tame in
compared
comparison.
to the other one.
It's a little janky and raw in comparison to Good News, and it did the production definitely caught my ear. But still, I was kind of, I guess, expecting more folky weirdness like Jesus Christ.
Right.
And what I got was Teeth Like God's Shoe Shine,
exactly.
which it was this, like, it blasted through my ears, and it was like it was like having a shot of espresso in a way, and just like it just thundered through, and it shook me through, like, different, like I said, it has different almost movements to it.
It's a roller coaster of a song.
It's a roller coaster of a song, and I think my reaction was, I want to hear that again. And this was also around the time American Idiot came out, going back to Green Day. So I was also in the songs shift and change
Sure.
around. But Franz Ferdinand's "Take Me Out" has kind of
Sure.
a up and down shift.
Sure.
And I loved it. I ate it up. It was raw. It was crazy. It was not what I was expecting.
Yeah.
But I knew I wanted to hear it again, and I did listen to that album a lot. I bought that CD in Washington D.C. or in Virginia somewhere at a mall on a middle school trip.
Really?
Yeah, I believe that's when I got that. Or maybe it was a high school trip. Could be confusing my two time periods. No, it couldn't have been. It had to have been later. It was definitely on a school trip in high school.
Mm-hmm.
And it was not. It was in high school and it was on a school trip, but it wasn't DC. It was probably Chicago or something. I got it, and I remember popping it in on the bus back home.
Sure.
And just like be letting myself get taken away and listening to that album on a bus on a long stretch of road in the Midwest. Actually, is a really appropriate way to listen to Modest Mouse.
Oh yeah,
it's very appropriate.
It's the best way to do it.
And actually, that's probably a good way to end this.
Absolutely.
We kind of full circle here. We went on a long drive.
We did go on a long drive, and I just want to say, man, Modest Mouse was just one of those bands where they kind of have something for everyone in terms of the indie rock fan. If you're looking for beautiful production and you're looking for like an art piece, look no further than Moon in Antarctica. If you're looking for something that might be a little more poppy or a little more catchy, Good News, or even like Strangers to Ourselves, But if you're looking for something that's satisfies that raw punkness, Lonesome Crowded West. I mean, Modest Mouse really are have been a changing and evolving band throughout their whole career.
Absolutely. It's a smorgasbord.
Yeah.
It's all tasty in a certain way. So my name is Jeff Jones.
If you disagree with us, well, then you're wrong.
And if you disagree with us, get out. And he is Dan Orr.
Yep.
And we are both music nerds, and we hope you enjoyed The Whole Record. And check us out on Facebook, The Whole Record. Mm-hmm. And we will hopefully have this uploaded very soon. Thank you.